Think of every left-handed person you know. Now think about how many left-handed world-class boxers, fencers, and baseball pitchers you've heard of. That number is wildly out of proportion, and the reason has almost nothing to do with skill. Let's start with the actual puzzle here, because on paper, and by every rule evolution normally follows, left-handedness should not exist at all. Roughly 10% of people on Earth are left-handed. That number has held remarkably steady across recorded history, across every culture anthropologists have studied, regardless of how that culture treated left-handed people, and many cultures treated them badly. For most of human history, left-handedness was actively punished. Children were forced to switch hands in school. Some languages still carry the bias in their bones. The word sinister comes directly from the Latin word for left. Left-handed people have historically faced higher rates of certain injuries, simply because tools, machinery, and instructions are built almost entirely around the right-handed majority. The suppression wasn't subtle either, and it wasn't limited to just one country or one era. As recently as the mid-20th century, teachers in many countries routinely tied left-handed students' preferred hand behind their backs or wrapped their knuckles until they switched. A practice documented widely enough that researchers later coined a specific term for the lasting effects pathological left-handedness, describing children who'd been forcibly converted and showed measurable difficulties, afterward stuttering reading problems, and general coordination issues that hadn't been present before the forced switch. Society didn't just fail to select against left-handedness. In many places, it actively tried to eliminate it by force, generation after generation, and still failed. By every normal rule of evolution, a costly trait with no clear benefit should shrink over generations until it disappears. This one hasn't budged in thousands of years, so the first question isn't why left-handedness exists, it's why hasn't it vanished. The genetics turn out to be stranger than expected. Handedness isn't controlled by one simple gene the way eye color roughly is. British psychologist Chris McManus, who spent decades studying this, proposed something called the right shift theory. His model suggests most people carry a gene that nudges development toward right-handedness, but it's not absolute. It's a nudge, not a rule. Identical twins who share essentially the same genetic code still end up with different handedness in a meaningful percentage of cases. Something during development, possibly random, possibly related to conditions in the womb, is deciding this independently of genetics alone. Handedness isn't purely inherited. Part of it looks almost like a coin. Flip your biology runs once, early, and then locks in for life. That coin flip may happen earlier than anyone expected. Ultrasound studies tracking fetal movement have found that a preference for sucking one specific thumb over the other shows up as early as 15 weeks into pregnancy, months before birth, long before any social influence or environment could plausibly be shaping the choice. Follow-up research tracking those same children after birth found a strong correlation between which thumb they preferred in the womb and which hand they favored later in childhood. Whatever decides, this is apparently already running before a baby has even been born. But a coin flip doesn't explain why the outcome consistently lands at 10% worldwide, generation after generation. Random chance alone should drift around. This number doesn't drift. In 2004, French researchers Charlotte Forey and Mitchell Raymond went looking for an explanation, and what they found had almost nothing to do with tools or writing at all. They studied handedness rates across traditional societies with varying levels of interpersonal violence and found something striking. Societies with higher rates of homicide and physical conflict also had higher rates of left-handedness. Peaceful societies trended lower. The pattern held up across multiple independent populations. Their theory is now known as the fighting hypothesis. The logic works like this. In hand-to-hand combat, most people train their entire lives against right-handed opponents because right-handers make up the overwhelming majority. A left-handed fighter throws punches, aims blades, and moves from an angle almost nobody has meaningfully practiced against. That unfamiliarity is a genuine tactical advantage, and in a violent enough environment, it's an advantage that can be the difference between surviving a fight and not. Here's the part that explains why the number stays locked at 10% instead of climbing higher. This is called negative frequency-dependent selection, and it's a strange kind of advantage. It only works while left-handers stay rare. If half the population became left-handed, the surprise factor disappears completely. Right-handers would simply start training against left-handed opponents as a normal, expected possibility, and the advantage would vanish. The trait's usefulness is directly tied to staying uncommon, rare enough to surprise. common enough to survive. That balance is the whole system. There's a neurological layer to this too, and it might explain why the surprise factor is so real in the first place. Studies using brain imaging have found that left-handed people, on average, show less strongly lateralized brain function than right-handers, meaning language, spatial reasoning, and motor control are distributed slightly more evenly across both hemispheres instead of concentrating heavily on one side. A more evenly split brain, a less predictable body. Some researchers now think this may translate into genuinely less predictable movement patterns, subtle differences in timing and trajectory that a lifetime of practice against right-handed opponents simply hasn't prepared people for. The advantage might not be purely about which hand throws the punch. It might be about a nervous system that was never built quite the same way to begin with, which brings us back to the sports data from the beginning. Researchers studying elite athletic performance have found this exact same pattern showing up decades later in a completely different context. In interactive combat and reaction sports, boxing, fencing, and batting against a pitcher in baseball, left-handers are dramatically overrepresented at the highest competitive levels compared to their 10% share of the general population. In elite fencing, left-handed athletes have made up as much as a third of top competitors in some studied cohorts, roughly 3 times their share of the general population. In baseball, left-handed pitchers face batters who see far fewer left-handed throwing motions across a season, giving each pitch a split-second unfamiliarity advantage that adds up over an entire career. But in individual, non-interactive sports like golf, where there's no opponent actively reading and reacting to your movements in real time, that advantage almost completely disappears. Same trait, same rarity, same ancient logic, just running on a scoreboard instead of a battlefield. Here's where it gets stranger, though, because humans might be alone in this entire arrangement. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, show individual hand preferences, meaning a specific chimp will reliably favor one hand over the other. But at the population level, chimpanzee handedness splits close to 50-50. There's no consistent species-wide lean toward one side the way there is in humans. As far as researchers can tell, this stable, population-wide right-handed majority, with a protected left-handed minority locked in place by its own rarity, appears to be a distinctly human arrangement. Something about human social structure, cooperation, tool sharing, or conflict specifically seems to have built this balance, and built it to last in a way that simply never emerged in our closest evolutionary relatives, despite millions of years of shared ancestry and remarkably similar hands. And the trade-off is still fully active today, even outside of combat and sports. Modern tools remain overwhelmingly designed for right-handed use. Scissors, desks, car ignition placement, spiral notebooks, power tool safety guards, almost all of it assumes a right-handed user by default. Right down to which way a doorknob turns. Left-handed people still report higher rates of minor injuries from tools built without them in mind, particularly power tools, where safety guards and blade angles are engineered around a right-handed grip and can expose a left-handed user's hand to the cutting edge instead of shielding it. The disadvantage that should have erased this trait thousands of years ago genuinely never went away. It just kept getting outweighed by something else, in exactly the context where being different from everyone else was worth more than being comfortable. So the next time you notice a left-handed pitcher, a left-handed fencer, or just someone struggling with a right-handed desk in a lecture hall, understand what you're actually looking at, not a random quirk, not a flaw evolution forgot to fix. A trait that has been too costly to keep and too useful to lose for thousands of years running, held in permanent, delicate balance by the exact same rule that made it valuable in the first place. Stay rare enough to surprise everyone else, and the disadvantage turns into the whole point.